Amid all the bonus backlash, a Goldman Sachs advisor is defending compensation in the finance industry, saying pay inequality helps everyone. He also says spending from hefty bonuses will help boost the economy. So, is he right? Dan Gross is a senior editor and columnist at Newsweek. Dan has written a lot about executive compensation. Dan Mitchell is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. Great to have you both.
Good to be here.
So I'll use your last names as well. Dan Gross, certainly the argument makes sense. And also the fact that Goldman Sachs has repaid the TARP means that they have no obligation to the government when it comes to setting compensation.
Well, look, there's no question that in the New York area, high compensation for Wall Street people has good spillover effects. If you're a real estate broker in the Hamptons, or you run a restaurant, or you're a nanny, you're benefiting from this directly. But you and I know that a lot of people who get paid these large sums, they're not going to take that money and go vacationing at the Grand Canyon. They're going to go to the south of France. They're going to buy their luxury goods from overseas.
Oh, so you have a problem with it because they're going to spend it?
No. I think we overestimate.
Okay.
It'll plow itself into the New York region, but the idea that it'll somehow help people who are struggling in malls in Cleveland, I think, is a little tenuous.
Well, the problem is we can't tell people where to spend money once we've given it to them. So
no, we can't.
The solution would be then what?
Well,
not to give the money in the first place?
As far as Goldman Sachs is concerned, that's between them and their shareholders.
Okay.
The issue with financial services, where compensation is 50% of revenues, is that it has worked out pretty badly for the owners. I mean, if you're a shareholder of Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, Merrill Lynch, Citigroup, AIG, what did you get from 10 years of them paying out 50% of every dollar in revenues as compensation? You got nothing. And at many firms, not Goldman Sachs today, but AIG, Bank of America, Citigroup, it's a zero-sum game between the taxpayer and the insiders. Every dollar that Bank of America or Citi, which both owe about $45 billion to the taxpayers, every dollar they pay out in compensation is one less dollar they have to pay back what they owe the taxpayers. So
Dan,
it's setting up as a zero-sum game.
Dan Mitchell, I'm guessing that your attitude is, if the taxpayer, or if the shareholders are dumb enough to put up with it, so be it.
Yeah, that's exactly it. This is not my business. It's not Dan Gross's business. It's certainly not the business of the incompetent politicians and bureaucrats in Washington. But if a company is free of taxpayer subsidies, they should pay their executives whatever the shareholders are willing to pay them. Now, if I was a shareholder, I might think these guys on Wall Street haven't done a good job, and I might try to get together with other shareholders to put some limits on, or at least tie pay more clearly to long-term performance. But the last thing I want are the 535 least competent people in America, i.e. the U.S. House and Senate. I don't want them interfering. These are the guys who created the financial crisis with Fannie and Freddie and the bad monetary policy. Washington is a toxic stew for the economy.
To be fair,
so
Dan
I'm not
Mitchell,
defending these guys.
To be fair, there can be plenty of fingers also pointed at some of the bank executives out there. I'm not out there trying to defend anybody, but let's just be fair about this. You know, Dan Mitchell makes a good point. You're a shareholder and you don't like it, just leave.
Just suck it up.
Take your money
Well,
out. Take your money out. Put it in another bank where you like the compensation policies.
I suppose, but if you're in an index fund or if you're in a pension and people are investing on your behalf, you don't really have that choice. And of course, if you take that attitude that we should be dumping shares of companies that don't perform or that pay out large executive compensation at a time when their stocks are failing, by that logic, we would all sell our American equities and invest them somewhere else, because we have got zero return in 10 years. I mean, we're breaking out those Dow 10,000 cap. I'm sorry, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with getting zero return in 10 years?
No, what's wrong with dumping?
Good system.
Whoa, let me get a question in here, Dan. Yeah. Well, what's wrong with dumping U.S. equities and going somewhere else? That's capitalism.
I think, well, a lot of people can't dump U.S. equities because their 401ks only invest in domestic index funds. I mean, you have this notion that shareholders are always banding together to produce optimal outcomes when it comes to compensation is a myth. I mean, you can't produce an example for me of shareholders of an investment bank banding together to kind of alter compensation. It just doesn't exist. And there's no positive correlation between companies that pay a lot in compensation and shareholder return. And in fact, I think you could point to many examples of precisely the opposite.
Dan Mitchell, what about that?
Dan Mitchell,
what about the argument, Dan Mitchell, that Dan Gross makes here, that the model is broken, that shareholders really are ineffective because of the way the system works, and therefore cannot make these decisions or make these moves.
Oh, I'll agree with part of what Dan is saying. I think a lot of the laws we have, the anti-takeover laws and things like that, entrench management at the expense of shareholders, and I think we could look at some of those policies. But here's one thing I know. I mean, it may very well be that shareholders aren't as effective as they should be, but one thing I know for sure, the least effective group of people to get involved would be the people in Washington. They will make it worse. The politicians are only looking for good headlines and raising campaign cash. They're going to screw up the economy if we give them more power. Let's stop the bailouts, stop the intervention. Let's actually try something radical for a change, a genuine free market. We haven't had that since Reagan.
All right, Dan and Dan, thank you very much. We're out of time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Dan Gross, Newsweek, senior editor and columnist. Dan Mitchell, senior fellow, Cato Institute.